Heinrich Müller, nicknamed even within the Nazi apparatus as Gestapo Müller, was the operational head of the Gestapo at the heart of the RSHA. Unlike other more visible leaders, Müller did not need speeches or propaganda to be feared. His power lay in the archives, in the signature that moved arrests, interrogations and deportations, and in the daily coordination with the regime's repressive machinery. When the war ended, his name became an obsession for Nazi hunters. He was, in practical terms, the man who knew too much. In April 1945, as Berlin crumbled under the Soviet siege, Müller remained at the core of power. Testimonies from those who were in the bunker and its surroundings place him in the final days of Hitler in the Chancellery and Führerbunker area, still carrying out security and interrogation tasks. He is remembered as someone convinced that falling into Soviet hands was not an option. After those final hours, he simply disappeared. There is no conclusively identified body, no documented capture, nor a proven escape. From 1945, the hunt began. Allied services, post-war German police units, and investigative teams searched for him for years. Declassified archives show that his official trail went cold in Berlin in April 1945, and yet rumors and contradictory leads continued to arrive. His family environment and people who had worked with him were monitored in hopes of intercepting a minimal signal, a letter, a contact, a movement of money. Nothing solid appeared. Over time, the most sober hypothesis was consolidated, that he died in the final battles or committed suicide in the chaos of Berlin's fall, and that his body remained unrecognizable or buried without a reliable record. Versions have existed regarding an alleged finding and burial in a mass grave at a former Jewish cemetery in Berlin, and even claims were publicized that the mystery was solved, but without a conclusive exhumation to close the case with historical certainty. Therefore, Müller remained an anomaly, probably dead in 1945, but without a verifiable end, the highest-ranking Nazi leader whose real fate remained shrouded in shadow, Ernst Kaltenbrunner. If Heinrich Müller was the invisible cog of the Gestapo, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was the man who, from 1943, occupied the administrative apex of the system that directed it. Austrian, trained as a lawyer and an early member of Nazism, Kaltenbrunner rose within the security apparatus until he became head of the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, in January 1943. This detail is key. The RSHA was not a mere ministry, but the brain that unified the security police and the party's intelligence service. Within this structure were integrated the Gestapo, the Kripo, and the SD. From there, arrests, persecutions, deportations, and the crushing of resistance in occupied territories were coordinated. His rise to the position occurred after the death of Reinhard Heydrich and during the radicalization of state terror. The war was no longer just a military front, it was an internal war against entire populations. Under Kaltenbrunner, the police apparatus became a central hub for distributing orders, reports, and solutions to the problem the regime had already decided to resolve by extermination. He did not need to be present at every field or execution. His role was to maintain the chain of command that allowed all of this to function without pause: permits, transfers, jurisdictions, police reports, coordination with the SS. At Nuremberg, the prosecution presented him precisely as a central piece of the final stretch of the system. As the Reich shrank, violence became more intense and more bureaucratic at the same time. When the collapse of 1945 came, Kaltenbrunner did not disappear like Müller. He tried to hide. He fled to Austria, to the mountainous region near Altausee in the Tozgebirge Massif, with false documents and a small group of companions. But in May, he was located after a search combining local intelligence, witness tracking, and US patrols. His capture, recorded by counterintelligence units and US troops, was the abrupt end of his attempt to blend in among refugees and fugitives from the Reich. Unlike other hierarchs who tried to negotiate or construct technical narratives, Kaltenbrunner faced the trial of the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg as the official controlling the security apparatus. He was charged on several counts, and the verdict found him guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death. On October 16, 1946, Kaltenbrunner was executed by hanging, closing his story not with escape or exile, but in the very place where the world first tried to legally name a state terror machinery, Josef Meisinger. Josef Meisinger was one of those Gestapo officers who did not need a top position to leave a terrifying mark. In the 1930s, he was already part of the trusted circle Reinhard Heydrich brought to Berlin to consolidate the Gestapo as a political tool, and within the apparatus, he earned a reputation for brutality and the ability to carry out dirty orders without flinching. He was not a grey bureaucrat. He was an operator with a hunter's instinct, useful for tasks where the regime did not want inconvenient witnesses or moral doubts. His name became especially linked to Poland. After the invasion, he was assigned to the security structure in Warsaw and held positions within the security police and SD in the district. In that context, he was associated with the daily terror that defined the first years of occupation: reprisals, executions, systematic persecution of Poles and Jews, and a climate of fear managed as policy. For this period, he would be remembered with a nickname that summarized his reputation: the Butcher of Warsaw. The nickname was not rhetorical exaggeration. It described the perception of an official who turned collective punishment into routine. But Meisinger did not fall in Europe. In 1941, he was sent to the Far East as a Gestapo SD liaison at the German embassy in Tokyo, a post mixing counterintelligence, surveillance of disloyal Germans, and cooperation with Japanese services. From there, he remained a man of the apparatus, though his war became more clandestine. Informants, lists, suspicions, and embassy maneuvers. There are even references to attempts to influence Japanese authorities against Jewish refugee communities in Asia, an echo of the regime's anti-Semitic obsession transferred to another theater. When Japan surrendered, his fate changed abruptly. On September 6, 1945, Meisinger surrendered in Japan and went into US custody. He was intensely interrogated and transferred for further statements because the Allies linked him to crimes committed in Warsaw. For months, his case traveled through intelligence and justice circuits. He was not just a prisoner, he was a connecting piece of archives, orders, and responsibilities. In 1946, he was extradited to Poland. There, the story was no longer about the liaison in Tokyo, but about the executor of terror in Warsaw. Tried by the Supreme National Tribunal in Warsaw, he was sentenced to death on March 3, 1947. 4 days later, on March 7th, he was executed at Mokotów prison. For Meisinger, the post-war period did not end in escape or anonymity. It ended with a sentence that returned him to the place where his name had been marked: Arthur Nebe. Arthur Nebe was not the chief of the Gestapo like Müller, but his name is attached to the very heart of Nazi terror because he controlled an indispensable part of the system, the criminal Polizei or Kripo, the criminal police of the Reich. In 1936, he came to lead it, and when the RSHA was created in 1939, that police force was integrated into the same superstructure that contained the Gestapo and the SD. In other words, Nebe did not need to carry the Gestapo stamp on his card to operate within the same machinery, share files, competencies, and objectives, and sustain the logic of persecution that the regime called state security. The turning point in his story came with Operation Barbarossa. Before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Nebe volunteered to command Einsatzgruppe B, one of the SS mobile extermination squads. His unit operated in the rear of the Army Group Center, mainly in what is now Belarus, and his own reports accounted for tens of thousands of murders by the end of 1941. These were not isolated excesses. They were planned operations of mass shootings against Jews and other victims defined as undesirable, with logistical support and coordination with police and military structures. Under his command, public terror was also used, with hangings and executions in front of gathered populations as a method of control. At the end of 1941, Nebe returned to Berlin and resumed his career within the RSHA. That return did not cleanse him. It returned him to the bureaucracy of crime with the internal prestige of someone who had proven useful on the most brutal front. In 1944, his name also appears linked to another sinister episode. After the Great Escape at Stalag Luft 3, he is credited with a role in selecting recaptured prisoners who were executed, a reprisal turned into procedure. Then came the political collapse. Nebe was involved in the July 20, 1944 conspiracy against Hitler. When the assassination attempt failed, he fled and hid for months, as if his participation in the plot could rewrite his past. He was arrested in January 1945 after being reported and brought before the People's Court. Sentenced on March 2nd, he was executed at Plötzensee prison on March 21st, 1945, hanged according to the method of humiliation ordered by Hitler for the conspirators. Thus ended Nebe, not as a resistor, but as an executioner who fell late when the Reich was already crumbling in its own hands. Edward Strauch. Edward Strauch represents a particularly disturbing profile within the Gestapo RSHA universe, the jurist who became an executor. Trained as a lawyer and an SS officer, his career grew within the apparatus of the security police and the SD, that is, the same network where the Gestapo operated as the main tool of persecution and repression. In 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, Strauch moved from bureaucratic security to open violence. He was commander of Einsatzkommando II within Einsatzgruppe A, a mobile unit created to clean the rear through mass murder. This fact is not minor because it places Strauch where Nazi terror ceased to be a threat and became industrialized execution in the open air. In the Baltic region, his unit is linked to large-scale shooting operations, and his name is associated in historical reconstructions with the Rumbula massacre near Riga, one of the largest killings of Jews in the Baltic. Later, Strauch was appointed Kommandeur der Sicherheitspolizei und des SD, or Commander of the SD in Weißruthenian, White Ruthenia in occupied Belarus, a post that concentrated police control and coordination of persecutions, raids and executions. In 1944, when the Eastern Front was already lost, his career took another turn. He was transferred to Brussels as KDS. There, in a different occupied territory, the pattern remained the same: security apparatus, surveillance, repression of resistance, and administration of fear. The end of the war did not find him as an impossible-to-trace fugitive. He was captured, and his name entered the judicial circuit that sought to prove personal responsibility for mass crimes. Strauch was tried in the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, in the Einsatzgruppen trial, or Case 9, where a US military tribunal convicted him of crimes against humanity and sentenced him to death. The sentence was pronounced in April 1948. Unlike other convicts who ended up on the gallows, Strauch was transferred to Belgian custody to be tried there for crimes committed in occupied territory. In Belgium, he received another death sentence, yet he was not executed. The Belgians considered him mentally incapacitated, and the case remained caught between sentence, custody, and psychiatric evaluation. His end was neither escape nor pardon. Edward Strauch died in custody on September 15, 1955, in a hospital in Uccle, Belgium, without either of his two death sentences being carried out. Alois Brunner. Alois Brunner was, according to many researchers, the most efficient executor of the deportation machinery. Austrian, an SS officer with the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer, he worked under Adolf Eichmann and was repeatedly identified as his right-hand man for turning lists and orders into trains departing for ghettos and camps. His power did not come from a visible position or a frontline uniform, but from a method: identify, concentrate, confiscate, transfer, and record everything in files that made the crime administrative. Before and during the war, he moved through several nodes of extermination. In Vienna, he participated in the mechanism that first stripped the Jewish community of its property and then deported it. Later, he operated in Greece and Slovakia. In Thessaloniki, within a very short time, raids, searches, and forced concentration resulted in mass deportations that destroyed a historic community. In France, his name became associated with Drancy, the large transit camp on the outskirts of Paris. As commander between June 1943 and August 1944, he supervised convoys that sent nearly 24,000 people to death. Overall, he is credited with responsibility for the deportation of over 100,000 European Jews from various occupied countries. When the Reich collapsed, Brunner did what he knew best: disappear with discipline. He relied on networks of former comrades, false documents, and post-war chaos. While Europe tried to rebuild courts and gather evidence, he moved in the shadows. In May 1954, a French military court sentenced him to death in absentia, but the sentence did not reach him. By then, he had already left the European circuit, and his trail moved to the Middle East. In Damascus, he lived for decades under the protection of the Syrian state, using false identities, such as the alias Georg Fischer, and nicknames like Abu Hussein. Various reports describe him as an advisor connected to intelligence services, valued for his experience in repression and interrogations, and protected for political reasons even against formal extradition requests. France insisted for years, and in 2001, a court in Paris again sentenced him in absentia, this time to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity. There were attempts to eliminate him. In 1961, a letter bomb tore out one of his eyes, and in 1980, another explosion mutilated the fingers of one hand. Over the years, reports attributed these attacks to Israeli services, but Brunner survived and returned to the shadows. His end remains uncertain. Credible reports place him dead in Damascus, with dates ranging from December 2001 to around 2010, and in 2021, a court in Vienna officially declared him deceased. His story ends with a dark irony. The man who turned human life into paperwork ended up protected by another security apparatus until disappearing without a final in-person trial. Karl Otto Koch. Karl Otto Koch was not a Gestapo chief in the strict sense of the organizational chart, but he was a top-level cog within the same repressive ecosystem. An SS officer who ran key concentration camps and worked within the SS Totenkopfverbände network that maintained the daily terror of the Reich. His figure helps understand a paradox of the immediate post-war period. Some of the worst men of the system did not fall before Allied judges, but before the Nazi apparatus itself, for reasons that had little to do with justice. Koch accumulated power as a commander in a chain of fates that brought him close to the center of horror. He was at Sachsenhausen and, above all, was the first commander of Buchenwald from 1937, a camp that grew under his command into a complex of forced labor, systematic punishments, and executions. Later, he was also sent to Majdanek in occupied Poland. During his years of command, the camp was not just a place of confinement, it was a death economy where a prisoner's life was worth less than his clothes, his gold teeth, or the paper on which his number was recorded. But Koch's end did not come because of the suffering he administered, but because of what the regime considered an internal disgrace. From 1943, within the SS, an investigation into camp corruption was opened. SS Judge Georg Konrad Morgan investigated networks of theft and personal enrichment, and in Koch's case, accusations of embezzlement arose, i.e., appropriation of property and money stolen from prisoners, with a component showing how corruption and murder mixed. He was accused of ordering the killing of prisoners to eliminate witnesses who could speak to the investigative commission. Simply put, the executioner fell because his greed left traces within the system itself. Koch was arrested and brought before an SS court. The verdict was devastating for the regime's corporate honor, death for discrediting himself and the SS. And the sentence was executed coldly and symbolically. On April 5, 1945, at Buchenwald, Koch was shot just 1 week before the camp was liberated by American forces. There was no major trial for crimes against humanity, nor a sentence for the system he ran. Only a final shot dictated by the same terror machine he had served, Wilhelm Stuckart. Wilhelm Stuckart did not carry the Gestapo seal in his office, but he was one of the men who provided the legal framework for the very repressive universe on which the Gestapo fed. A jurist of the Nazi Party and state secretary in the Ministry of the Interior, Stuckart was one of the co-authors of the Nuremberg laws, the regulations that turned racism into legislation and made persecution shift from an excess to a procedure. In January 1942, he also attended the Wannsee Conference, where the political and administrative logistics of the final solution were discussed. He represented the Ministry of the Interior, that is, the bureaucracy that transformed criminal decisions into regulations, decrees, and competencies. When the Reich collapsed, Stuckart tried to remain within a state that no longer existed. In May 1945, during the final days, he joined Karl Dönitz's ephemeral Flensburg government as Minister of the Interior. It was a brief, almost ghostly position, an administration attempting to negotiate and buy time while Germany was already de facto occupied. The illusion ended quickly. On May 23, 1945, the Allies dissolved that government and Stuckart was arrested and interned. His case came under scrutiny not for firing a weapon, but for being one of the architects who drafted the legal scaffolding that allowed mass persecution. In the immediate post-war period, his name circulated in an uncomfortable context. the technocrats of crime. He was interrogated, appeared as a witness in proceedings involving other defendants, and eventually sat as a defendant in the later Nuremberg Trials, specifically the Ministry's trial. There he was judged for his role in formulating and executing anti-Jewish policies and governance in occupied territories. The tribunal did not depict him as a simple, uninformed bureaucrat. It characterized him as a convinced anti-Semite who, from his office, could advance his campaign with institutional security. But when it came to sentencing, the case faltered on proof of certain levels of knowledge and direct participation in the deadliest measures. The result was striking. In April 1949, Stuckart received a time-served sentence of approximately 3 years and 10 months, released without additional penalty. What followed was a second, much smaller life in West Germany. In 1951, in a denazification court, he was classified as a Mitläufer or follower and received a relatively small fine. He obtained civilian employment. He worked as a municipal treasurer in Helmstedt and later at an economic institute in Lower Saxony. He also appears linked to post-war nationalist politics related to displaced persons. He died on November 15, 1953, near Hanover in a car accident, a conclusion that sparked later speculation but without conclusive confirmation, leaving his case as an uncomfortable example of how some system designers could reintegrate after surprisingly light sentences. Franz Six. Franz Six was the kind of leader the Third Reich particularly valued, an intellectual turned operator, capable of wrapping repression in analysis and propaganda. Within the RSHA, the same superstructure that contained the Gestapo, Heinrich placed him in charge of Amt 7, the department dedicated to written records and ideological research, producing anti-Semitic material, monitoring public opinion, preparing arguments to sustain persecution as if it were normal state policy. He was not a street-level policeman. He was an administrator of ideas and lists, someone who helped determine who should be watched, persecuted, and crushed. His name also became associated with a plan revealing the regime's totalitarian ambition. In 1940, Heinrich tasked him with preparing the police structure for an occupied Great Britain. Six was supposed to lead operations to locate and arrest thousands of enemies once an invasion occurred, relying on pre-prepared blacklists. The project was never executed, but it shows how the Gestapo/SD imagined occupation. First, take the territory, then capture the right people, and only then stabilize control. When the invasion of the USSR opened the bloodiest chapter, Six moved from the desk to the field. In June 1941, he was assigned as head of Vorkommando Moscow within Einsatzgruppe B. In this role, his unit reported executions, including a report on liquidations in the Smolensk area, and Six was marked as part of the mobile system of mass killings operating behind the front. Years later, this experience would become his condemnation, although he tried to minimize it. After the war ended, he did not disappear forever. He was captured and tried at Nuremberg in the Einsatzgruppen trial. In 1948, he was found guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and membership in a criminal organization. He received 20 years in prison, but the post-war political climate, with the Cold War rising, prompted a wave of commutations. His sentence was reduced to 10 years, and he was released in October 1952. The most uncomfortable part came afterward. Already in West Germany, Six managed to reintegrate. He worked as an advertising propaganda executive and was linked to Porsche. He was also connected to networks of former Nazis trying to regain political influence, such as the Naumann Circle, and documents, studies of US archives indicate links with the Gehlen organization in the 1950s. In 1961, he was even called as a defense witness in the Eichmann trial, but testified via deposition from Germany. He died in 1975, leaving the perfect portrait of a reusable criminal, condemned by a historical tribunal, released soon after, and absorbed into the new normality. Bruno Streckenbach. Bruno Streckenbach is a good example of how the Gestapo was not just the Berlin office, but a network branching into cities, war fronts, and offices. In Hamburg, from the early years of the regime, he became a key figure in the local political police. He led the city Gestapo and was later appointed inspector of the security police and SD for Military District X, a position giving him regional reach over arrests, persecution, and intelligence coordination. He was not a man of speeches, he was an organizer of cadres, files and orders, exactly the profile the system needed to become routine. With the onset of the war, his role shifted to a more brutal stage. In 1939, he was appointed commander of Einsatzgruppe I during the Polish campaign, one of those mobile groups that followed the army and carried out political cleanups, mass arrests, selective terror, killings. These units were not an anomaly. They were the forward arm of the same Gestapo RSHA universe, only operating with weapons, graves and lists. And Streckenbach not only commanded them, he also worked at the RSHA core, linked to administrative and personnel areas, placing him close to the human engineering of the apparatus, appointments, internal discipline, and deployments. His post-war life, however, did not follow the capture and Nuremberg pattern. He was first tried by the Soviet bloc. A military court in Moscow sentenced him on February 18, 1952, to 2 terms of 25 years forced labor, among other things for participation in repression and deportations, including the Sonderaktion Krakow, the arrest of Polish professors. He served prison time in Vladimir and in October 1955 was released and sent to West Germany as part of final prisoner releases. Back in Hamburg, he reintegrated with a difficult-to-digest normality, working as a commercial employee and authorized representative in an industrial company. Meanwhile, in West Germany, trials for Nazi crimes progressed slowly, and for years Streckenbach remained in that limbo where it was known who he was, but he could not be brought to trial. Only decades later did the net tighten. On June 30, 1973, charges were filed identifying him as responsible for mass killings, with a complaint mentioning enormous figures. But the trial never took place. His lawyers claimed a serious heart condition, and in September 1974, a higher court confirmed the indefinite suspension of proceedings due to inability to face trial. He died in Hamburg on October 28, 1977, without a conviction in Germany for the crimes attributed to him.